All right, so we're diving into a listener request today, and I think this one's going to be pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they want us to look into the story of Tony Abels. We've got his Wikipedia article and a couple other things.
Okay, cool.
So let's see what we can find out about this guy.
Yeah, let's do it.
So right off the bat, just looking at his Wikipedia article, it really jumps out at you that this is not just one crime. It's like a whole pattern of violence over decades.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be a theme here. A lot to unpack.
Yeah, for sure. So the article starts with his early life. He was born in 54, and then like just a few years later, by the time he's 16, he's already involved in a robbery that ends with someone dying.
Wow, 16 years old.
I know, it's crazy, right? And he ends up getting convicted for first-degree murder and gets a life sentence. That's in 1971.
So you think that's the end of the story, right? Life sentence?
Right. But here's where things get interesting. He gets paroled in 1983.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he even finds work as a construction worker. Like, you almost think, okay, maybe he turned things around.
Yeah, second chance. Maybe this is it.
Exactly. But that's not how this story goes.
Oh, it happens.
Well, just 5 months after he's released, there's another murder. The victim, this time, is 84-year-old Adeline McLaughlin. She was found in her apartment.
Oh, gosh, that's awful.
Yeah, it's really sad. The article says she had been suffocated with a pillow, her apartment was burglarized, and Abels had broken in through a window.
So it sounds like there were signs of a struggle, or at least a forced entry.
Oh, definitely. And what makes it even worse is that neighbors described her as this really quiet and friendly woman, like just trying to live her life peacefully in her retirement.
And then this happens. It makes you think about all those other elderly folks in that community living alone. They must have been terrified after this.
Absolutely. It really raises questions about how the parole system was working back then. Like, did they miss something? Were there red flags they ignored? Or was the whole system just flawed?
It's a tough question, for
Yeah.
sure. On the one hand, you want to believe in rehabilitation, second chances, all that. But then you see cases like this, and it makes you wonder if public safety was really considered enough in those decisions.
Yeah, you really have to weigh those things carefully. And unfortunately, this is only the beginning of the story. It gets even more complicated.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, in 1987, we have another murder. This time it's a 31-year-old woman named Deborah Kizor.
Okay, so 2 murders in just a few years after his release.
Exactly. And this is where things get really disturbing. The article says that Abels was actually in a relationship with Kizor at the time.
Hold on, he was dating her.
Yeah, they were together. And yet he wasn't even considered a suspect back then.
Wait, what? But that seems like the most obvious place to start.
Yeah.
Investigate the people closest to the victim.
Right, exactly. Especially considering his history, it's mind-boggling how they could miss that connection.
It really makes you question the thoroughness of the investigation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Like, was it just a lack of communication between different parts of law enforcement? Did they just not put the pieces together?
It's hard to say for sure. It's also worth remembering that this was 1987. They didn't have all the tools we have now, DNA technology and all those fancy databases.
Right. It was a different time for investigations. They had to rely more on things like eyewitness accounts and physical evidence found at the scene.
Which, speaking of, did the article mention anything about what was found at the crime scene?
Yeah, it said she was last seen at a payphone, and her body was discovered along this path with a pair of blue jeans lying nearby. Just those little details, you know.
It's like you can almost picture her final moments. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. But here's the thing. It was DNA evidence from those jeans years later that finally linked Abels to her murder.
So they had that evidence the whole time, but they didn't have the technology to connect it to him.
Exactly. Imagine that Kizor's family had to wait almost 20 years for that answer.
It's almost like a cruel irony, isn't it? The technology to solve the case existed, but it wasn't available yet. So they had to wait all those years.
It makes you think about all the other families out there still waiting for answers in cold cases, and how DNA technology has brought closure to so many of them.
It's amazing what science can do, but it's also a reminder that justice can be really slow sometimes. Those families had to wait a long time.
Absolutely. And in this case, the article mentions that Abels was never actually charged with Kizor's murder. Even though they had the DNA evidence, they did officially book him for McLaughlin's murder.
Hold on, so he's been booked for one but not charged for the other, even with DNA evidence.
It's really confusing, right?
It really is. You'd think the DNA would be enough,
Hmm.
but I guess there are other legal things that need to be in place for them to move forward with charges.
Yeah, it's definitely more complicated than they make it seem on those TV crime shows.
Oh yeah, for sure. Real life is always messier.
So we have 2 murders, no charges yet, and this is still just the beginning of his story. There's another murder that he actually was convicted of, the case of Marlene Burns.
Okay. And who was she?
She was Abel's girlfriend, and they were living together. And sadly, their relationship fits into that pattern of violence we were talking about.
Oh, no. Really?
Yeah, witnesses said they heard them fighting and then saw Abel's running away from their place, wiping blood off his hands.
That's chilling. I hate to think what happened inside.
Well, the article describes it as this really brutal attack. She was pushed down the stairs, and then he beat and kicked her. It's just awful to even think about.
That poor woman, she must have been terrified.
I know, it's really disturbing. This time, though, there were witnesses who called the police. So Abels was arrested pretty quickly, and then eventually he was found guilty of her murder.
And what was the sentence?
Well, initially he was sentenced to death.
Wow, so they didn't mess around this time.
Yeah, it was clearly a serious crime. But then, 2 years later in 1992, his sentence was changed to life in prison.
Really? Why the change?
That's where things get even more complex.
Okay, I'm all ears.
His brother testified during the sentencing and talked about how rough their childhood was.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, their dad was abusive, their mom left when they were young, just a lot of trauma.
So the court took that into consideration.
They did. It seems like they saw those experiences as contributing to his mental health issues. And so they commuted his sentence to life in prison.
It's a tough call, isn't it? Trying to balance the severity of the crimes with the factors that might have led to them.
Absolutely. And in this case, the judge decided that his mental state warranted a change in sentencing.
It really makes you think about the whole purpose of punishment, doesn't it? Like, is it just about retribution, or is there also a responsibility to consider rehabilitation and the impact of things like childhood trauma?
It's a complicated issue for sure. And as if this whole case wasn't already complex enough, there's one more thing to add to the mix.
Oh no, what now?
The article quotes a police major named Michael Puetz, who suggests that Abels might be linked to other unsolved crimes.
Wait, are you serious?
Yeah, he says there's a possibility that Abels was involved in other cases.
Oh, wow. So even though he's in prison now, there could be even more victims out there.
Yeah.
And their families are still waiting for answers.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It really is. We started with this Wikipedia article thinking we were just going to learn about one guy's story. And now we're talking about multiple murders, potential unsolved cases, the parole system, DNA evidence, mental health, childhood trauma. It's a lot.
I know, right? And this is just part one. We've laid the groundwork, but there's so much more to unpack. We need to dig deeper into each of these cases, understand the legal nuances, and try to grapple with all these ethical questions that keep popping up.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to discuss.
This is definitely turning into one of our most intense deep dives yet.
I can't wait to see where we go next.
So let's go back to Adeline McLaughlin for a minute. Remember, she was murdered just 5 months after Abels was paroled.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that he was out trying to, rebuild his life and then this happens.
I know. It's just tragic. The article mentions that she was a widow and had moved to Florida from Massachusetts. She was enjoying her retirement.
And then her life is cut short like that.
Yeah.
It's just awful. And to think about all those other elderly people in that community who must have been so scared after this.
Right. It really shakes your faith in the system. Like, how could someone with Abel's history be considered safe to be back in society? Did they not do their due diligence?
Well, it was a different time back then. The risk assessment tools they used were probably different. The whole parole system might have been different.
I guess that's true. But it doesn't make it any less tragic. And it really makes you think about all the factors that go into these decisions, Rehabilitation versus public safety.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a delicate balance. And unfortunately, in this case, it seems like they got it wrong.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow. And it just makes you think about how important it is to constantly be evaluating and improving these systems so things like this don't happen again.
Right. Because there's always going to be some level of risk.
Yeah,
But you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to minimize it.
for sure. Okay,
Like-
so moving on to Deborah Keysor. This is the case that I think really got to me. Because remember, Abels was dating her at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And he wasn't even a suspect. That's crazy to me.
I know. You would think that would be the first place they would look. The victim's boyfriend, especially when he has a history of violence.
Right. Just seems so obvious.
Mhm.
So was there any explanation for why they didn't look at him more closely at first?
Well, the article didn't really go into detail, but I wonder if maybe there was a lack of communication between different parts of law enforcement, Or maybe they just didn't connect the dots right away.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
And remember, this was before they had widespread DNA testing.
Yeah.
So they couldn't just run his DNA and see if it matched.
Exactly. They were relying more on old school detective work, eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, that sort of thing.
And what kind of physical evidence did they find?
Well, the article mentioned that she was last seen at a payphone and that her body was found with a pair of blue jeans nearby.
Just those little details. It makes you think about what her last moments must have been like.
I know. It's really sad. But here's where it gets interesting. It was DNA evidence from those jeans years later that finally linked Abels to her murder.
Wow. So they had that evidence all along, but they didn't have the technology to analyze it back then.
Exactly. It took almost 2 decades for that connection to be made. And in the meantime, her family was left wondering what happened.
It's amazing how far DNA technology has come, isn't it? It's helped solve so many cold cases and brought closure to families who had given up hope.
It really is remarkable, but it also makes you think about the cases that happened before this technology existed. How many people got away with murder because they couldn't be linked to the crime?
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. And it makes you appreciate how important it is to keep pushing the boundaries of science and technology to solve these crimes.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about 2 murders that Abels wasn't charged with. Now let's talk about the one he was convicted of. Marlene Burns.
Okay, so remind me, who was she again?
She was Abel's girlfriend and they were living together. And from what the article says, their relationship seems to have been very volatile, with a lot of fighting.
So it fits into that pattern of violence that we've been seeing with him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it escalated to a really horrific attack. Witnesses reported hearing them arguing, and then they saw Abels running away covered in blood.
Oh no, it sounds like it was really bad.
It was. They found Burns at the
Yes.
bottom of the stairs. It seems like he pushed her down and then beat and kicked her. She didn't stand a chance.
It's just heartbreaking to think about another woman's life taken too soon.
It really is. But thankfully, there were people who saw what happened and called the police. So Abels was caught pretty quickly.
So what happened then?
He was put on trial and convicted of her murder. And initially, he was sentenced to death.
Wow, that's a serious sentence.
Yeah.
So they must have really seen this as a heinous crime.
They did. But then, a couple of years later, his sentence was changed to life in prison.
Wait, what? Why did they change it?
That's where things get a little complicated. During the sentencing phase of his trial, his brother testified about their childhood.
Okay, and what did he say?
He talked about how they were abused by their father and their mother left them when they were young. Just a really traumatic upbringing.
So the court took that into consideration when they changed his sentence.
It seems like it. They saw those experiences as contributing to Abel's mental health issues, and they decided that life in prison was a more appropriate punishment than death.
That's a really tough call to make, isn't it? Trying to balance the severity of the crime with the circumstances that might have led to it?
It really is. And there are a lot of different opinions on how these kinds of cases should be handled. Some people believe that the punishment should always fit the crime, no matter what.
And others believe that you had to take into account things like mental illness and past trauma when deciding on a sentence.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. And it's something that the justice system has to grapple with all the time.
For sure. And even though Abels is behind bars now, there's still that lingering question about whether there might be more victims out there.
Right. That quote from the police major saying that there could be other unsolved cases connected to him.
It's a chilling thought, and it makes you realize that even with a conviction, there might not be complete closure for everyone involved.
It really underscores the importance of those cold case units that investigate unsolved crimes, even years later.
Absolutely. They're doing such important work trying to bring justice to victims and their families, no matter how much time has passed.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of justice never really ends. Man, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a pretty intense deep dive, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely not an easy case to unpack. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Multiple murders, a troubled past, and then those lingering questions about other potential victims. It all adds up.
It's definitely made me think about things in a new light. No, we started with just a Wikipedia article, and now we're having these big conversations about the justice system, ethics, and the impact of trauma.
And don't forget about the human cost. We can't lose sight of the fact that real people were affected by these crimes. Adeline McLaughlin, Deborah Kuzzer, Marlene Burns. They were all victims of violence, and their families are still living with that loss.
It's true. It's easy to get caught up in the details of the case, but we have to remember that these were real people with lives and loved ones. Their stories are what make this case so impactful.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that even though Abels committed these horrible acts, he was also a product of his environment. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it does add another layer of complexity to the story.
It's that nature versus nurture debate, right? How much of who we are is determined by our genes and how much is shaped by our experiences.
Exactly. And in Abel's case, it seems like his childhood trauma played a significant role in his life trajectory. Again, not an excuse, but definitely something to consider.
It makes you think about how important it is to address childhood trauma and provide support for those who've experienced it to try to prevent these kinds of cycles of violence from continuing.
Absolutely. Early intervention is key. And it's not just about preventing future crime. It's about giving people the tools they need to heal and build healthy lives.
For sure. Okay, so before we wrap things up, I wanted to circle back to something we talked about earlier. The blue jeans found near Deborah Kieser's body.
Oh yeah, the ones that eventually led to Abel's being linked to her murder through DNA evidence.
Exactly. It just struck me how such a seemingly small detail could be so crucial to solving the case.
It really highlights the importance of thoroughness in investigations.
Mhm.
You never know what piece of evidence might end up being the key to cracking a case.
It's like putting together a puzzle. You need all the pieces, even the tiny ones, to see the full picture.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to preserve evidence and keep working on these cold cases, even when years have passed, because you never know when that missing piece might turn up.
It's a reminder that justice can be slow, but it's always worth pursuing. Speaking of justice, I'd like to touch on the court's decision to commute Abel's death sentence to life in prison.
Yeah, that was a complex decision for sure. It really gets to the heart of how we view punishment and rehabilitation.
It's not an easy question to answer, is it? On the one hand, you have the severity of the crimes, which were absolutely horrific. But on the other hand, you have the mitigating factors, like his mental health and his traumatic childhood.
Well, it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the court decided that life in prison was a more appropriate sentence in this case.
It's definitely a decision that sparks debate. And it raises those big questions about the purpose of the justice system. Is it purely about punishment? Or is there also a responsibility to consider the possibility of rehabilitation?
And how do we balance the needs of the victims and their families with the rights of the accused is not a simple equation.
It's definitely a lot to think about, and I think this whole deep dive has really highlighted the complexities of the criminal justice system in a way that I hadn't fully grasped before.
I agree. It's easy to have these black and white views of crime and punishment, but when you really dig into a case like this, you see all the shades of gray.
For sure. Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking this case. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of the story of Tony Abels and the many issues that it raises.
I second that. There's been really thought-provoking conversation, and I hope it encourages our listeners to keep learning and exploring these kinds of complex topics.
Absolutely. Remember, folks, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the world around us, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions and create positive change.
Well said. Until next time, stay curious and keep those deep dives coming.